Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. In case you haven't figured out by the way the show started, things have changed a little bit around here. I'll get to that in a second. I don't do shout-outs unless the listener is from way far away, like Australia. Lindsay used to live down under, and now she's in England. I can't imagine moving to another country, let alone to the other side of the world. Well, howdy, Lindsay. I hope you enjoy tonight's show. Way back when I first started doing Strange Things podcast, I used Arturo's equipment. He's one of these guys that likes to change things all the time. One day I would show up at the studio and find all the electronic equipment was rearranged or replaced. It was confusing and made doing the show a bit weird. I would have to ask him what buttons I needed to push to get things back to where I could use the recorder in other parts of his studio. On occasion, he would completely move the studio to a different location, and I'd have to go hunting around trying to find the equipment that I recognized so I could do the show. Then one day on my birthday, my wife bought me the entire podcasting setup. Arturo set the thing up, so all I had to do was talk. That was a few years ago, and things have changed. My broadcasting program stopped working, and I had to come up with a new program to record the show. So I went from Nicecast to GarageBand for recording purposes. Arturo had found a new soundboard for his show, and he offered to get me a copy, but like I said, I'm not real keen on changing things, so I said I'd stick with the soundboard I had. Last week, my soundboard stopped working. The software is so far out of date, it isn't even listed anymore. I tried to get a new soundboard, but my operating system is too old to get the latest download. I thought I could spend a few $100s and get the whole new system to do the show, or I could just do it without the soundboard. So that's what I'm doing. At the halfway mark, I'll be doing the few commercials, but just saying what I used to have recorded. I could play the saved recordings, I have, but man, that's a lot of moving parts. I'm not big into editing my show. I do the research, I record the show, and then I send it out. Some folks, for example, Paranormal Sideshow, they record the show and then Stacy spends, I guess, half her life editing the show so it sounds good. Nah, I don't have that kind of time. Maybe in a few weeks I'll change my mind and replace some of the old and out-of-date equipment. Let's see what happens. Right now I'm working on my next book, and I needed to drive to McAllen Library to dig through their archives. I have to thank Esther for her help in digging up stories from the past. I listen to music while running around town, but on long trips I listen to other people's podcasts. One of my favorites is Expanded Perspectives. Cam Hale and Kyle Filson out of Weatherford, Texas. They were talking about how their computer crashed as well. They lost some of their stories and sound effects. They now refer to it as hashtag 2020. Anytime something goes wrong with a computer, it will be known by that moniker. So, I'm not the only one experiencing new and interesting things while putting out a show. If you happen to have any ghost stories or cryptid sightings or UFOs, and they're from the southern part of Texas, let me know and I'll put them in the book. You can send them to me at strangethings@arkanasa.com. If you have really cool ghost stories from other parts of the country and you want to share them, you can go ahead and send them in too. I won't put them in the book, but I might use them on the show. Before I get going about the third man, if you listen to the show much, you'll know I tend to make fun of those folks in white lab coats that think they know everything. Some might think I don't hold scientists in a very high regard. Maybe if they made a few less mistakes, I might just stop picking on them. The experts said there was going to be a full lunar eclipse July 4th at 11:30. I looked at several websites run by high and mighty scientificers, and they all said the same thing. July 4th, 2020 at 11:30 p.m. was to be the maximum lunar eclipse. Me and my wife were out on the driveway from 11 until 11:45 waiting to see the big show. I even watched the countdown clock at the scientists' website. It said the eclipse was underway. Then it said it was halfway over. The moon was still a nice complete orb. It didn't even change colors. Not even a tiny little shadow could be seen. I checked a few other sites that all said the eclipse was happening. So, who got things wrong? Who used the wrong calendar? The people we knew were sending messages asking if anybody in the Laredo area could see anything. The eclipse was a total bust here. It kind of reminds me of that time NASA was sending a probe to look at Mars. They were using inches and feet. Well, at least some of them were. The other half of the team was measuring in meters. Millions of dollars were spent on this space probe only to watch as it slammed into Mars because the scientists couldn't figure out whether they should use feet or meters. Now I know people make mistakes. I make them all the time. I've made so many mistakes I'm actually getting good at it. I don't get paid millions of dollars from our taxes and then confuse feet and meters. Feet. Maybe if the scientists had put up their own money and then got reimbursed if and only if they got it right, I'll bet they'd make a lot fewer mistakes. Just a thought. I like Jeremy Wade. If he's on TV, I'll watch his show. If you haven't read his book yet, I suggest you get a copy and give it a read. It is a fascinating story about how Wade wound up with his own TV show. He goes into a lot of details on some of his fishing trips that never made it to the TV. River Monsters was one of my favorite shows, which is odd because I don't like fishing. I don't have the patience for it. I get bored after the first few minutes and I want to go do something else. I used to have a really hard time laying in, waiting for someone to cross the river. His new show, Mysteries of the Deep, is out now, and it's on my top 5 list of shows. Oh yes, of course, The Curse of Oak Island is number 1. Oh, look, it's a Bobby Dazzler. Some of you will get that. On Mysteries of the Deep, Wade was talking about the third man phenomena. I've heard others talk about this inexplicable occurrence. For the one or two of y'all that don't know this, here is the basis for the third man. Back in 1915, people were still trying to get where no man had gone before. They all wanted to be there the first. Ernest Shackleton had decided the place to be was the South Pole. Back then, there were no planes capable of flying through the horrible conditions. So the explorer set out by ship to land in an inlet that, during nicer weather, was open to the sea. Knowing things might get bad, they took along a supply of food, a big supply of food. He was able to secure the use of a ship named the Endurance. The Endurance departed from South Georgia, which is an island and not the part of the United States, for the Weddell Sea on December 5th, heading to Vahassel Bay. As the ship was heading southward, they began running into ice. The ice was thin enough the ship could break through. It did slow them down, but they were there for a reason, and so the ship pushed on. Deep in the Weddell Sea, conditions grew worse. January 19th, 1915, the Endurance was brought to a full stop, stuck fast in an ice floe. The ice floe was not stuck in one place, but the ship was stuck to it. So wherever the ice floe went, the Endurance had to go as well. By February 24th, Shackleton realized the Endurance was not going to break free, so he ordered the crew to leave the ship and make camp on the ice. Why would anybody do such a thing? The ship's hull might suddenly collapse as the ice crushed the sides in and sink too fast for the men to escape. By setting up camp on the ice, they could wait for the ice to melt, and then the ship would float free and they could climb back on board the ship. The ice floe began making its way north, which, well, actually it wasn't north, it was heading south because everything at the South Pole would be south. The crew sat on the ice waiting for spring. Food was running a bit low. Rationing was going from bad to worse. Between the cold and the lack of food, his men were facing death. It's one thing to be hungry while sitting in a nice tropical climate where you need to drink a lot of water and consume a little bit of food because you don't need to create warmth. When you're freezing, when you're cold, you need a lot more food. That's why in the Army, whenever we would do cold weather training, we would get more food. It's what your body used to stay warm. When you don't have enough food coming in, your body starts to burn other things for fuel. Things like muscle fiber, which is a bad thing. The ice around the hull of the Endurance continued to build up until the wooden boards gave in. As Shackleton and his men watched, the ship sank. For almost 2 months, Shackleton and his party camped on a large ice floe, hoping that it would drift towards Paulet Island, which was about 250 miles away. There were provisions stored on the island, and this would mean the difference between starving and freezing to death or surviving. The first plan was to walk to the island, but this didn't work out, so they decided to pull the lifeboats and use those instead. See, when they abandoned the ship, they took all the lifeboats with them, just in case. When you're crossing the ice in an expedition like this, they don't just walk along. They pull the lifeboats along with them, so if they need be, they can jump into the lifeboat. Shackleton decided to set up a more permanent camp, which he named Patience Camp, on another ice floe. By March 17th, their ice camp had drifted closer and was within 60 miles of Paulet Island. Things went in the wrong direction when on April 9th, their ice floe began breaking up and the crew was ordered into the lifeboats. See, it was a good thing they had them along. They had to dodge huge chunks of ice as they managed to maneuver to the nearest land. After 5 days at sea, the men landed their 3 lifeboats on Elephant Island, 346 miles from where the Endurance had sunk. This was the first time they had stood on land in 497 days. With their provisions running low and no chance of rescue on the desolate island, Shackleton now faced another grueling decision. He picked 5 of the strongest men, which included the ship's navigator, to accompany him in a small open lifeboat for the next journey, 720 nautical miles across the stormy sea to a whaling station on South Georgia Island. Shackleton only took enough provisions for a one-way trip. knowing that either they would make it to rescue or they would lose the attempt. He was well aware that the lives of all the men stranded on Elephant Island depended on his success. There was no plan B. It was make it or die. Elephant Island was an inhospitable place and far from any shipping routes. The odds of rescue were about as long as could be. People knew the Endurance was somewhere in Vassell Bay, but the crew was nowhere near where they should have been. Shackleton decided to risk the open boat journey to South Georgia Whaling Station, where he knew help was available. The best of the 3 lifeboats was only 20 feet long. They christened it the James Caird after the expedition's chief sponsor. The ship's carpenter made some improvements like raising the sides, strengthening the keel, building a makeshift deck of wood and canvas, and sealing the entire thing with oil paint and seal blood. Shackleton and his crew sailed the James Caird through a storm that came up out of nowhere. They were in sight of the whaling station, but due to the storm they couldn't land. They spent a long, freezing night in the lifeboat just offshore, with the wind and the waves threatening to capsize the boat or smash them against the rocks. The following day, the weather improved enough for a safe landing on the south shore. The trouble was, the whaling outpost was on the other side of the island. Rather than risking another sea voyage, Shackleton chose to attempt a treacherous land crossing. He left 3 men behind with the boat. Shackleton and 2 companions set out for the grueling 32-mile hike. No one had ever attempted walking across this island before. They knew they were on the island, but not how to cross it. There were no landmarks or maps to follow. Everything was white with snow. As Shackleton said, of all the adversities he had faced during the failed expedition, the march across the island was by far the worst. Shackleton and his men had lived on the ice for over a year now. They were cold, starving, and desperate. They had barely survived the journey in the open lifeboat to the island. The 32 miles that lay between their landing and salvation would be considered the most difficult feat. They had no provisions left. Their clothing was worn out and not suited for what they were doing. They had to dig deep to find the ability to keep going. Have you ever run a marathon? You will hit the wall. It comes on you like a freight train, and when it hits, you're done. It usually comes at about mile 19 to 23. And since a marathon is 26.2 miles, that last 4 to 7 miles is all mental. You either have it upstairs or you quit. Find a nice soft spot on the ground and sit. You're done. Shackleton and his men couldn't give up. Not only would they die, but all the men back at the base camp would die as well. So they pushed on. As they stumbled along, the 3 men became aware of somebody else walking with them. It wasn't visible. It wasn't a material being, but there was someone there. This other kept the men going. The being didn't say anything. No words of encouragement. No assist with a helping hand. But simply by walking in front of them, they were able to follow. The men walked through a blinding snowstorm, only able to stay in the right direction because they knew this other being was leading them. Now, I know there were 3 men following another's presence. This would make 4. But the term became known as the 3rd man because of the poem. Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you. Gliding, wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman, but who is that on the other side of you? This poem was written by T.S. Eliot and is called The Wasteland. It is based on the story of Ernest Shackleton, who had experienced a presence or a third man syndrome during the final leg of his journey in the mountains of South Georgia. I guess Eliot didn't know there were 3 men and not 2. Calling it the fourth man just doesn't sound right. It sounds a bit crowded. The third man is properly defined as a sensed presence in times of great physical and mental duress, a benevolent companion that remains by for the duration of time that a person is facing extreme crisis and disappears as soon as the danger has passed. This companion, which despite the moniker has been described as both male and female, is credited as leading pilots to safe landing sites, encouraging lost hikers onwards through blizzards or dense jungles, tending to the ill, and comforting the stranded. Unlike reports of guardian angels, whose intervention is often quick and mostly unseen, the third man endures the same adverse conditions as the experiencer until safety or rescue is obtained. In his memoirs, Shackleton wrote, "During that long and raking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountain and glaciers of South Georgia, it seemed to me often that we were 4 and not 3. Shackleton and his 2 companions continued walking, following the mysterious fourth presence. They marched day and night across the wilds of South Georgia. When at long last the whaling station appeared on the horizon, the fourth man simply vanished. Shackleton initially believed that he was the only one to sense this guiding presence. The men were so exhausted and so focused on putting one foot in front of the other, they didn't have the energy to talk. Weeks later, however, his navigator, Worsley, admitted that he had a curious feeling on the march that there was another person with us. Each of the men who endured that death march through the snowstorm had felt the same divine companionship, and yet did not share their experience with any of the others until much later. They all thought the others would think they had lost their mind. Shackleton managed to return to the far side of the island and get the 3 men left at the landing. It would then take him 3 tries, but eventually he rescued every one of his men from Elephant Island. Shackleton remains a hero, not only for his grit and determination, but for his courage to face any odds for his crew. Henry Stoker. Recognize the name? He was a cousin of Bram Stoker of Dracula fame. Henry and 2 British sailors were taken prisoner during World War I. The 3 men managed to escape from a Turkish prison camp. They could only move at night to avoid recapture. Their provisions consisted of raisins and cocoa. I wonder where the heck they got that. I mean, I've seen some survival kits, and I've seen some Army-issued rations before, but raisins and cocoa? I must admit, though, when you're tired and hungry, military cocoa is pretty good. If you're just sitting at home and you want to drink some cocoa, don't bother. It tastes horrible. Well, these men were exhausted, hungry, and cold. By the 11th night, they found themselves facing a particularly difficult, soul-sapping march through a mountain pass. In the midst of the night, I felt not suddenly or surprisedly, that we were not 3 men struggling along in line, but 4. There was a 4th man following at the end of our line, in the correct position for the 4th man to be. When we stopped for a few moments' rest, he did not join us, but remained in the darkness, out of sight. Yet, as soon as we rose and resumed our march, he dropped into his place forthwith. He never spoke, nor did he go ahead to lead us. His attitude seemed just that of the true and loyal friend who says, "I cannot help, but when danger is at hand, remember always that I am here, to stand or fall with you." Stoker and the other men made it through the mountain and finally reached an area where they could stop and relax a bit. They lit a small fire and used it to thaw out and heat some of their meager provisions. This was when Stoker realized the 4th man in their group had vanished. He said something about how he had felt the 4th man was with them, to his 2 companions. The 2 men both said they had thought the exact same thing. They said it was like someone was keeping an eye on their rear, so nobody could sneak up on them. It made them not quite so desperate about running from the Turks. A Stoker later wrote, "We had all 3 been sensible of his presence throughout the most trying part of the night. We all 3 agreed that the moment he left us was when we felt we had put the danger behind. I cannot exaggerate how real his presence was, how content one felt, despite the mystery of it that he should be there." The presence of the 3rd man is most often felt. On a few occasions the being is seen, and sometimes they're only heard. September 11th, 2001. Ron DeFrancesco was stuck on the 84th floor of the World Trade Center. He was above the impact zone. He tried to make his way down a stairwell, only to find it filled with people who were all trapped by the flames and the smoke. When he discovered that a collapsed wall prevented further descent, he laid down on the concrete with the rest of his colleagues, gasping for air and trying to think of a way out. All of the re-entry doors from the stairwell back into the building had been stuck. They were all shut, so going up was not an option, and a wall of fire and debris blocked any route downwards. Suddenly, Ron said, he began hearing a mysterious voice telling him to get up. It was a male voice, but he couldn't identify to who it belonged. He was sure it didn't belong to anybody trapped in the stairwell with him. The voice told him to continue descending through the wall of fire. Now, this sounded like a crazy idea. Nobody knew how far down the fire might be. It could be a few stories, or it could be the next 10. The voice insisted that he keep going. Realizing he didn't have a choice, he made a run for it. Ron was burned by the fire, and the thick black smoke was too polluted to breathe. He ran down 3 flights of stairs, listening to a voice of an unseen man who continued to encourage him to keep going. "You don't run towards the fire," Ron DeFrancesco admitted later. Had he succumbed to fear and stayed where he had been, he wouldn't have made it out alive. Ron described taking strength and comfort from that voice, which gave him the courage to forge ahead. Once he reached the lower set of stairs, he was found by the firefighters, who helped get him to safety. Ron was the last person to make it out of South Tower alive before it collapsed. And now for those commercials I promised you that were coming. I don't know, some of y'all might not care for them, but, well, it's my show. You don't like them? Do your own show. If you hear a bump in the night and you think you might have unwanted guests, contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society. They do more than just ghost hunts. You can reach them at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. If you have to hold things out at arm's length to see them, you might want to get your eyes checked. Check out Optica del Norte at 107 Calle del Norte, right across from the Embassy Suites. How about taking better care of your skin? Call Lourdes James at 956-723-3019 and get a free skincare class. Oh, provided you're in the area. We're not flying halfway around the world to do a skincare class. And last but not least, coffee is what makes the world go round. Why drink bad coffee when you can get the best coffee on the planet? Go to the Organic Man Coffee Trike and start enjoying life. And there, those are my commercials. No soundboard, no music. Hopefully my listeners will be happy with that. James Sevigny was climbing Delta Form Mountain in Canadian Rockies when an avalanche ripped him and his climbing partner off the mountain and drove them 2,000 feet into a valley. James awoke with a broken back, both arms, his nose, and several ribs. He also was suffering from internal bleeding. James said he couldn't move to save himself. He looked around, trying to spot his partner. He found the other man was nearby, but soon realized from his twisted form that he had not survived the fall. James managed to crawl over near his friend and then sat back to wait for death to come collect him. That's when a presence appeared, not to his vision or his consciousness, but mentally. James heard the words, "You can't give up. You have to try." James said, "It told me what to do. The only decision I made at that point was to lie down next to Rick and fall asleep and to accept death. That's the only decision I could make. All decisions made subsequent to that were made by the presence. I was merely following instructions. I understood what it wanted me to do. It wanted me to live." Despite his horrific injuries, the voice encouraged James to keep going. It cajoled him when he wasn't moving fast enough, and it even bullied him to walk or to crawl the mile through ice-encrusted snow back to camp. The presence disappeared when James Sevigny reached his tent and was rescued by some cross-country skiers. Most people meeting with the third man say the presence was not an extension of their own mind. They did not imagine it. They all said the presence was a real entity that offered guidance and comfort. It is not unusual for solo climbers to split their meals into two portions before suddenly realizing their error. They were about to share their food with the other being. After a climbing accident in 1978, Rob Taylor was injured and stranded on a ledge high up on the side of Kilimanjaro. He had no choice but to crawl into his tent, zip up his sleeping bag, and wait for his partner to make it down the mountain to find help. Rob was losing blood from his fractured ankle. To make life interesting, the injury was developing gangrene. He lay there in his tent, waiting for rescue or death, when he saw a figure crouching next to a nearby boulder. The person didn't speak, but Rob could see the outline clearly through the falling snow. At first, Rob thought it was another climber who had walked up on his campsite. After calling to the person to come near, Rob began to wonder who or what he was looking at. Day after day, Rob lay in his tent, growing weaker. He noticed the figure had moved closer. Rob became incensed by this odd behavior, and he began throwing rocks at it. He demanded to know what it wanted. Finally, when Rob was close to death, the figure was sitting at the foot of his sleeping bag. Despite Rob's inability to make out defining features in the darkness, he was always sure that the presence really existed. Rob said the mystery shadow was solid. It was there, occupying space like a stone or a tree would. After several days laying in his tent, not alone, but in the company of this unknown being, Rob heard somebody calling his name. He looked out the tent flap and yelled back to the rescuers. At the same moment, the shadowy figure next to him vanished. After being carried down from the mountain, Rob told about his companion. Later on, he said, "I don't even talk about my companion, Watcher, these days. He's a creature out of place here, misunderstood." After the breach, when I first spoke of him to people, they reacted quite predictably. "Ah, what an imagination! Your fever had you hallucinating." At first I persisted in my stand. He was real, there in the flesh, or at least in some concrete form I couldn't see. Later, I left him out altogether. It was easier than trying to define or defend him to people who could not understand. Now I know this, and say this to you. He was there, and as real as you or I. I do not know to this day his purpose, but I sense that it was good. Joshua Slocum was the first man to sail around the world on a solo voyage. His sloop, the Spray, was headed into stormy weather when Slocum fell ill with severe food poisoning. His condition was so severe, he was forced to take refuge inside his boat and just hope for the best. He lay there half unconscious as his boat sailed on, left to its own devices. After languishing in the cabin for too long, Joshua became aware the boat was sailing through a storm. He drug himself to the hatch and looked out towards the helm. There, he saw a tall man standing at the helm, as if riveted to the spot. The boat would roll back and forth, and the mariner would keep the prow aimed into the waves, keeping it from capsizing. The man at the helm looked as if he'd been steering ships at sea for decades. When Joshua caught the mariner's eye, the man said, "I have come to do you no harm. Lie quiet. I will guide your ship tonight." The next morning, when Slocum was recovering enough, he found his ship was remarkably still on course, despite the storm the night before. More astonishingly, he had traveled 90 miles despite the rough seas, and was in a better position than he should have anticipated. When asked about the experience later by a reporter, Joshua was just as certain as to the reality of the presence. Once back on dry land, Joshua told of his bizarre encounter, saying, "If ever there was a man at a ship's wheel, one still at the wheel of the Spray through that livelong night. No thing could be clearer to me than that." People used to talk fancier back in the day, and sometimes what they quote as having said, it's hard to say. 1954, Ennio Tira and Fred Erickson of the French Foreign Legion were being shipped to Saigon. Having heard the stories of what was waiting for them, the two deserted their ship, throwing a raft and some supplies into the ocean. France had been losing their war in Indochina for years, but they kept pouring men and equipment in, hoping for the best. The Vietnamese army, well, they didn't take prisoners. The idea was to send a message back to France that these men that you keep throwing in here, they're all going to die. The two men were in a busy waterway, and they hoped they would be picked up quickly by another passing ship. But the days stretched on endlessly with no sign of rescue. Tira and Erickson floated adrift on the ocean for nearly a month, suffering second-degree sunburn, thirst, hunger, and exhaustion. When Erickson finally died, Tira was forced to push his body over the side and let the sharks have it, rather than let it rot next to him in the small raft. After that, Tira was left on his own with no one to share his misery. Alone in the vast sea, Tira became aware of a presence in the raft with him. He realized the presence had actually been with him for some time, before his friend had died, but only acknowledged the presence after several days. I didn't pray, and I'm not a religious man, usually, but the whole voyage I'd had a strange feeling that somebody else was with me, watching over me and keeping me safe from harm. I sensed it in the storm when we were nearly overturned, and many other times. It was as if there were sometimes 3 people in the raft, not 2. With Erickson dead, I felt it was more strange. I felt it more strongly than ever. After 34 days at sea, Tira began to feel the mysterious presence was gone. He began to feel as if he'd been abandoned, and this made him think he was going to die all alone in the middle of nowhere. Just about the time he realized the other was gone, a ship came into view, heading straight towards him. His third man had left just as rescue was coming close. I couldn't talk about the third man phenomena without talking about the movie as well. Based on the emails I get, a lot of you watch the same movies and listen to the same things I do. Some of y'all will be familiar with the movie The Third Man, the one with Orson Welles that came out in 1949. From the moment it was released, it was appreciated equally by highbrows and the general public. It could be considered to be a romantic thriller or a complex work of art, depending how you thought about it. Kind of like the movie The House of Leaves, I believe it was. If you read The House of Leaves and you think horror story, you're going to be reading a horror story. But if you read The House of Leaves and you think romance story, you'll be reading a romantic story. It's kind of a weird book. If you've never read the book, it's something else. To begin with, it's, I think, 3 stories mixed in together. There's the story of the guy writing the book, there's the story of the house that he's reading about, and then there's the story about the guy that's in the house that he's talking about. It's a complex story. In order to keep things straight, the writer uses different fonts. So you can look at the different fonts and you know which part of the story you're reading. Then the writing does all kinds of crazy things. It goes around the edge of the page, or it goes one word to a page for a couple of pages, and then there's like, you've got to see the book to understand it. And check out The House of Leaves. I've read it a couple of times now, and I still think of it as a horror story because that's what I like to read. Anyway, back to The Third Man. Joseph Cotton plays Holly Martin, who arrives in Vienna to meet up with his old pal, and his old pal is named Harry Lime. Once there, Holly is picked up by the military that are in charge of the English section. Vienna was divided into sectors after World War II. Within days of the end of the fighting, April 1945, the provisional city government was constituted and the political parties reemerged. The situation of the city was far from encouraging. More than 20% of the housing was partially or completely destroyed. 87,000 flats that were all what we call apartments had been uninhabitable. The imperative of the immediate after-war period was to solve the most basic problems and get the city back to some degree of working order. The political context was no less complicated. The Allied occupational forces refused to accept the Nazis' territorial expansion. In other words, those districts which had existed until 1938 were divided into 4 Allied zones. The inner city district was administered by all 4 powers: United States, Britain, France, and Russia. They called this the Inter-Allied Zone. Lower Austrian communities, which had been merged with Vienna in October 1938, were considered to form a part of Lower Austria, and those were all under Soviet control. The Allies occupied Austria from 1945 to 1955. Think of a country being run by a committee that doesn't have their best interests at heart. Now, think of a country being run by 4 committees that don't get along and don't have the country's best interests at heart. This was Austria after World War II. For the first several years, there were shortages of everything, especially medicine. So, in the movie The Third Man, Harry Lime is a black marketeer who has made a small fortune selling anything people needed but couldn't get. Things like antibiotics. The folks buying his product discovered he'd been taking the 100 milligram bottle and making 200 milligrams out of it by adding water. So, his medicine wasn't any good. They wasted their money and people died from it. Harry Lime sounded like a real jerk. And then you meet him in the film and he seems like an awful nice guy that just made some bad choices. Orson Welles made Harry Lime into a lovable guy that was just trying to survive. Yeah, he did kill that guy and he did sell another guy out to the authorities, but he made it sound like it was the best thing to do. The movie was very complex, and the more you watch it, the more you begin to root for Harry and hope he gets away from the long arm of the law. Joseph Cotton's character turns in his best friend, so he begins to be the bad guy, even though he's doing what is considered to be the right thing. The idea of a third man comes up in the film several times. You get to wondering who was the third man seen by the porter, who winds up getting killed. Holly says he's writing a book called The Third Man. I've seen the movie several times, and I still don't hold Harry Lime in a bad light. A lot of folks that saw the movie loved him, so much so that Orson Welles made dozens of radio shows where Harry Lime is the sort of hero who tells the story of him breaking the law but mostly winding up doing the right thing. I've listened to the radio shows as well. I think there's maybe 52 shows, and you can listen to them by just searching Harry Lime Radio. It's a pretty good movie. Yes, it's black and white, it's an old movie, but if you're into old thrillers and back when actors actually acted, check it out. The Third Man with Orson Welles and Joseph Cotton. 1933, Frank Smythe made it to within 1,000 feet of the summit of Mount Everest before turning around. On the way down, he stopped to eat a mint cake, which he cut in half to share with the person with him. As he was handing the food over, he realized he was traveling alone. There was nobody there, yet he felt compelled to share what he had with this other being. Someone who wasn't there, but who had seemed to be his partner all day long. On Nanga Parbat, 1970, a climb during which his brother died, Reinhold Messner recalled being accompanied by a companion who offered wordless comfort and encouragement. Mountain climbing to me is not a thing. There's way too much chance of dying just so you can say, "You see that mountain? I clomb it." People are lined up waiting to climb Everest. People who see themselves as being the next Edmund Hillary. Well, over 4,000 people have stood on top of the world. There's a line. You have to wait your turn for the photo op. You run up to the right spot, click a selfie or two, and then get out of the way because others have the same dream as you. People that see walking to the top of the world as being so important, they're willing to become one more body on the side of the mountain. The trip up is fraught with hazards. You're walking through the death zone. The oxygen levels are only a third of what they are at sea level, and the barometric pressure causes weight to feel 10 times as heavy. The combination of these two makes climbers feel sluggish, disoriented, and fatigued, and they can cause extreme distress on organs. For this reason, climbers don't usually last more than 48 hours in the death zone. Once you expend all your energy getting to the top, you now have to make it back down. This is why most people who die on Everest die on the way down. There are more than 200 dead bodies to admire on the side of the trail. Since they're all frozen, they will still be there this time next century. Don't even look into the Rainbow Valley. The colorful outfits people wear while mountain climbing are just as colorful once they stop breathing. So many have died in one area, the guides tend to push them over the side of the trail and into a valley. All the bright colors there for your viewing pleasure. Yuck. Well, in 1953, Austrian mountaineer Hermann Buhl became the first person to climb Nanga Parbat in the Himalayas. 26,660 feet. It's the 9th tallest peak in the world. He climbed by himself, and not far from this summit, he was forced to spend the night out in the open without a sleeping bag or tent. He hadn't planned on spending the night and hadn't brought the right gear. It was an agonizing night, but somehow Buhl survived. He later wrote he sensed that he shared the ordeal with a companion. Unseen and unknown, someone was there with him, sharing the extreme cold and wind. I had an extraordinary feeling, he wrote, that I was not alone. If you ever see me heading up the side of a mountain, look for rising water. This is the only thing that will get me to climb. Not a hiking trail. I do that all the time. I mean climbing, as in ropes and carabiners and things. I used to rappel a lot, but that was a part of the job, and that was going down and not up. The third man was not just somebody mountain climbers met. 1927, Charles Lindbergh felt. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew across... How the heck did I say felt? Try this again. 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic Ocean all by himself. He was piloting the Spirit of St. Louis, and this was way before autopilot or anything that could help keep the plane in the air if the pilot wanted to sleep. After 22 hours in flight, he was at the end of his endurance. He felt the Z-monster creeping up on him as he sat there with nothing to help keep him awake. If you look at photos of the airplane, you'll notice there was no windshield. Lindbergh could only look out the side of the plane. Being in the middle of the ocean, there was nothing to look at. He said he felt his eyes closing as he fought to stay awake, so he wouldn't die. Along about this time, Lindbergh said he felt as if there was somebody in the plane with him. There's no place for a second pilot or person to be. The cockpit was just big enough for one person to sit upright and close to the instrument panel. Yet, Lindbergh said he was not alone. This other person began talking, just things to keep the pilot awake. The pair talked about navigational problems, things that forced Lindbergh to think, which kept him awake, enough to keep flying and not dying. This other person stayed there, talking to Lindbergh right up until Ireland came into view. As Lindbergh spotted the island and knew Paris was getting close, the other person faded away. Lindbergh became the first person to fly across the ocean by himself. Although, was he really alone? Who or what could the third man be? To begin with, they aren't necessarily men. The poem was written about men who were accompanied through a hazardous travel by another man, but some folks have said they were being accompanied by a female-looking being. Some people who have had these experiences say the being was their guardian angel. Other people who weren't spiritual, at least in the least tiny bit, some of these were atheists. Yet, they were helped out of a really dangerous time by something unseen that just might have been an angel. Guardian angels don't care if you don't believe in them. They still do their job to help some folks survive. I think I've worn out several angels that did their best to keep me alive so I could do whatever it is I'm destined to do. I wonder how many of them are in therapy. I wonder, do angels stay around all the time? Like when I'm in the bathroom? Is there somebody there watching? I hope not. Well, unless I fall over in the shower, then it'd be okay to have somebody there to help. People say you don't choose your guardian angel, but they choose you. Wonder if there are different levels of guardian angels. Like, is there a bunch of elite angels that get sent if the person is a high-risk subject, as opposed to low-risk people like type B people? These are questions that kind of keep me awake at night. Things I sit there and think about when I should be trying to get to sleep. Something else I think about all the time that I wish I could get out of my mind. Mermaids. Every image ever done of a mermaid, it always shows a female upper torso with a fish's body, because there are scales. But then you look at the flippers at the very end, and the flippers are sideways. Now, fish don't have sideways flippers, they have up and down tail fins. Mammals like whales and dolphins have the side-to-side flippers, but they don't have scales. So either the artists are all screwed up, or the mermaids are something other than half female, half fish. It'd be more like they're half female, 30% fish, and 20% whale or dolphin. Yeah, things like that I think about when I'm trying to sleep at night, and usually that's the reason I don't get enough sleep at night. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell your friends what they're missing. Let them know that there's something out here to listen to besides their own breathing. Hopefully I've entertained you. Hopefully I've informed you. If not, give me some suggestions. Tell me what you'd like to hear about. You can contact me at strangethings@arkanasa.com. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.